So yeah. Yeah, so we have probably met in passing a couple times. I don't know if we've met formally, but Piergianna Mazzocca, my name is Martin Janssens. I'm an MArch 1 student here in my last semester, and this is just part of the Goldsmith interview series, where we can sort of talk casually before your lecture here at the UTSOA, where you teach as the emerging fellow in design over the past 2 years. So Piergianna, thank you for sitting down with me and answering a few questions.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Martin, for this.
Yeah. So my first question is about, I guess a lot of my questions are about pedagogies and your approach to pedagogy, because that seems to be at the heart of your research. But becoming an emerging scholar in design in a place like UT is quite an achievement, and I wonder how you got to that spot where, was there a turning point where you're like, oh, I want to be a professor, or now you feel like you've made it and this is the direction for your career?
Well, that's a tough one. I would say that, yeah, evidently, and you will see also this on the lecture. This is why making this lecture was a hard thing, because it was about like making a summary of that pedagogical project rather than just my own work, right? And I have to say that, I mean, it's a funny thing that you say, that you just said like, oh, probably you've made it as an educator. I don't know about that, but I still feel like, becoming an architectural educator, it's something that it's always in the making, right? Like trying to understand in what ways we can read the world around us, and the hardest part is like, okay, how can this be addressed through design, but through space, right? We can talk about many issues that are hard and complicated, but there must be ways by which design can address them through space. So spatializing those concepts is always the hardest part. And I think that pedagogically, the way I address that is, well, go back to history, right? Try to understand what have been the modes of understanding and spatializing, abstract concepts, and in what ways we can reinvent those. And in that reinvention, there is always room for, actual innovation, right? In which we might say, oh, actually, I think I can do this better, right? Like in my case, I have been, like an advocate at reinventing the use of type and typology in architecture as a way not just reproducing, historical types or classical notions of type, but actually understanding how, in that history and in the way in which we appropriate that history, certain of the, let's say, regimes of disciplining bodies are still embedded in those concepts. So in what ways can we use them but be more aware of them? In what ways we use them but actually trying to eradicate like the conflicting histories that they tend to perpetuate, right? So that is a good question in that sense. Then another aspect that I really interested in the pedagogy of architecture is that of aesthetics, right? We tend to think of it as being either an objective lens or a subjective one. Can it be both, right? Can it be just recognized as a category of knowledge on its own? So I think like I'm in that way, not just to disrupt everything because I think like that's a lot to do, but just finding ways of doing what we do, but in a more nuanced way.
I want to get a little bit into the aesthetics, maybe in a second. But first, I want to ask you: do you feel like you have more agency as a professor in the realm of architecture in the built environment, or as a practicing professional?
I mean, I would say that because as a fellow, right? Like it's a strange position. You're not in the establishment of architectural education. You're not in a tenure track, and therefore bounded by the sort of politics that come with that, right? So as a fellow, I do feel much more free than a tenure track professor might feel, right? But then I'm also not entirely a practitioner because even though I have started my own practice and now and then, collaborate in projects with colleagues and others. I feel like I use projects as a way of thinking and advancing, my way of thinking through architecture. So, so I would say that as the fellow, yes, there is indeed a lot of freedom in there. But I would say that academia or architectural education, dealing with it, just helps to, advance and investigate other topics that I wouldn't otherwise be able to advance or investigate entirely through practice. But the same can be said about practice in academia, right? Like I wouldn't be able to investigate certain things that I'm able to do in practice that I'm not able to do in academia.
Yeah, well, going to that question of aesthetics, I think there's a really good comparison to the work that comes out of your studio to something like the Harvard studios of like KGDBS and Lucian's Padmanabhan, where they have a very sort of distinct architectural identity or aesthetic identity to the representation of the projects. Because the professor, right, sort of tries to lead the way in that stuff, and maybe it's more the students leeching off of what the professor has done. But my question is, like, how do you toe the line of like trying to enforce an architectural aesthetic on the representation versus like letting the student just kind of explore what they want to explore?
I would say that it just depends also in the studio though. I mean, I would say, like, frankly, yes, in the vertical studio that I taught at UT, there was indeed a need and a desire on my part to kind of enforce a commonality of architectural representation. And that has a lot to do with where I was trained. I was trained on my master's degree at the Berlage, and we had for a short semester as an advisor David Van Severen, right? That is from KGDVS. But also in the context of the Berlage, there was a collective effort in maintaining a sort of, a stylistic, how to say this, like a stylistic like neutrality, just for the sake that projects can be comparable with one and the other, right? Not as a way of enforcing an aesthetic, but to be able to comprehend things similarly without, being bothered by a very particular or self-defined style. But later that, if we are able to find like that common ground, then we can collectively start to deviate from that sort of normative kind of design or stylistic rendering or representation of architecture. And that's something is also happening right now, like on my undergraduate studio. But then for the advanced studios though, even though the methods are equal throughout the board, throughout the entire studio, I actually asked the students to define their own representational strategy. And this has also to do with, what their interest or research questions are, right? I believe that, each project necessitates its own form of representation, and therefore, to achieve a sort of voice as a designer or architect or thinker, you also need to be able to appropriate the instruments of architectural language. And for that, if the studios, or at least my advanced studios and the ones with the theme of my research, have always tried to, let's say, give that as to each student their own agency to create and to investigate research questions through representation as well. Because in the end, like, this is the hardest thing about being an architect, which is the fact that we tend to think that, oh, well, we have to represent others, but we always forget that the act of representing others also negates those others' ability and right to represent themselves, right? So I would say that hopefully I've been trying to foster that, like, hey, like, you need to find also your own vocabulary. But yeah, I cannot help but give a bunch of references just for the sake of understanding how certain modes of representation are also tied to a certain history, why an axonometric drawing is the way it is.
Yeah. We mentioned research, encouraging students to pursue sort of different modes of research into something like architecture, which I think follows your sort of career path now, right? You're going to do a PhD after this, is that correct? Well, I guess my next question comes from Zeke Jones, who's a former student of yours in your Goodwill Better Studio a couple semesters ago or last semester. And he's asking, should all studios have a research component as rigorous and specific as the ones presented in some of your courses, or do you think that there's an openness that should be understood from studio to studio?
Yeah, I would say that I mean, what I've liked about UT is that I've been able to indeed frame each studio through a research-oriented like thematic, right? But if the Goodwill Better Studios do so more in parallel with my own research, then that research has started to open up paths for other types of investigations, right? My vertical studio measures of discomfort, right? Like it's trying to point towards a new path. Okay, what happens when we cannot, or we have to exist within norms and standards? So how can we, let's say, use those norms and standards to avoid normalization or the normalizing processes that come with that? Or my current studio right now, all together now, which has to deal with in what ways can we embrace and try to create and spaces for other types of kinship, right? That exist outside of notions, normalizing notions of what family is or with whom you should live, etc. Right? So those are like the main things that I have been dealing with at UT. But I have to confess that going back and reading each project, then I just believe that each project can then become its own research project, right? And I have indeed encouraged Zeke and Julia to have that, like even the project they did for my studio, to to understand it in a broader disciplinary set of concerns, right? And how that can even become a studio that they might teach in the future, right? Or even their own research agenda, whether it is through practice, through education, or even through writing, right? I do believe that we need, to ask more questions, and we also need to ask better questions. And I think that something that I've noticed that and that I encourage and support with my students is that like the agency for them to ask questions, right? Not just to think that they come to the school to learn something, but that they can actually, bring something other to the table, to a new discussion. And I've learned so much from that project, from that process.
Well, I think you do a very good job at elevating the student work as well with things like websites, which has just been published recently, right? The Good Better or Goodwill Better website.
Yeah.
Are you sort of approaching websites now, either with your own portfolio of work or with the curation of your studio, as a sort of progressive medium for architectural representation? Or do you think that will fall in line with, we've had this long history of architectural drawings like axonometrics, et cetera. Is that website in line with that now, and that's sort of the next step?
I mean, I don't know. I haven't had enough time to, think on this that much. But the desire of this is that just a desire of sharing knowledge, right? I do think that it is not just, sharing the work of students for the sake of having more references when it comes to representation. But again, just as I mentioned on my previous answer, I do think that students are bringing forward a set of questions and a set of, research that it's vital for, the survival of architectural education too. So I would say that the website is just a very immediate form of cataloging and becoming a repository of knowledge, right? And to make that accessible to everyone. I really wanted this to be indeed a physical exhibition, but because of we know things didn't turn out that way. But in a way, I do think that I preferred the website in this case, because it also becomes like a little web zine, right? Like if, the history of representation and the way we can go back and understand that history, there's also the history of architectural magazines, right? And the little, manifesto kind of magazines and zines that were done in architecture schools, or in particular movements that compile a set of projects that create, like a little incision or slide of that particular moment in time. So I hope that this website actually is doing something like that, right? That in the year 2020, these were the things that these architects and young designers were thinking at that time when they were addressing concerns about health.
Yeah, especially with things like the Wayback Machine, all of the internet is being archived, and so essentially you can go back in time and understand how architecture is progressing in the 21st century. Well, on that note of progress, where do you see your research going from here in terms of PhD, and how do you think that that's going to impact the field of architecture?
All right. Yeah. So yes, I've been researching the connections between architecture and health for the longest time, but more and more until a very recent moment, realized that I'm not just interested in health because we should, it has to do more with how health has helped framed what we do as architects, right? Or has justified, architectural intentions and all of that. So in that way, probably I'm more interested in the history of knowledge in architecture and how that knowledge is framed and formed, which is actually the starting point for my PhD research, which has to do with how transfers of knowledge regarding health started to exist between Western countries and then South America. So for example, I am founding my PhD proposal extensively on the work of Fabiola Lopez Duran, who has also investigated the sort of relationships, but in my case, as a way of departing from her, has to do more with, again, like this ideas, concepts that in her case were eugenics and social hygiene. In my case, have to deal more with, social medicine and how social medicine was practiced spatially in South American countries. So let's see. I'm, also interested in understanding where this is going to go. I understand that, like a PhD is a very long time. So I imagine it going, from this very broad set of concepts to a more narrow path.
I didn't mean to ask you to predict the future there. It's just
No.
a query into, a PhD in architecture is a very it's a very niche thing, right? Like it's not an often pursued idea. So I think it's really interesting to see those sorts of topics be explored over a long period of time. Well, in relation to health, maybe my last question will be on the pandemic that hopefully we're rolling out of now. I mean, that's put a huge stress on people's understanding of the relationship between architecture and space and health, right? In public health, personal health. I guess my question is not on that per se. It's more on like what has sort of been keeping you optimistic over the past year or so that we've been in isolation from other people.
Sure. Well, that is a good question, and I posed this question at the beginning of the lecture that I'm about to give, and try at the very end to address, what it would mean for architecture, or at least what I see it is important for us to take, and what has indeed kept me optimistic. So for the longest time, like I've always thought of biopolitics as this, super uneven mechanism by which power is distributed through individuals, governments, etc. But the pandemic also, revealed that sometimes we do need that. We need responsible governments, and we need to find ways of holding them accountable, right? So, so I would say that when it comes to architecture, for me, is less about how do you social distance, how do we rethink ventilation. I think it's less about that. I think it is more about the things that have been revealed that as a society at large we have not been great at, right? So, for example, the ways in which systemic injustices and racial segregation continues to be part of the built environment, right? So, talking about in what ways we can keep some of our streets open for people to do exercise, I think I'm more concerned about the fact that, well, people are not getting to their essential work, and to the size of where essential work is exercise. So anyways, I've found that even though there have been some architects and designers that have remained at that level of superficial reading of the pandemic, there have been others that are pointing to more in-depth interrogations. So I hope that we support and continue on that second vein and not on the latter.
Well, there's no better way to wrap up the lecture series here than your lecture. As the sort of departing, emerging fellow in design, I'm sad that our paths couldn't cross in the studio, but at least we got to talk for a little bit. So everybody that I've talked to who's taken your studio has really enjoyed the questions that you pose and the research that you're doing. And the work shows it's very successful and successfully represented, and it even got me to question some broader ideas in architecture. So thank you for teaching here at the university, and I'm looking forward to your lecture. So I won't take up any more of your time here. You can hop over there and that.
Well, thank you so much, Martin. And yes, of course, it would have been great to cross before, but you have my contact information. Let's keep in touch.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Good luck.
Bye.
I'll see you later. Bye.